A warm welcome to all the English literature enthusiasts. Hope everyone is fine and doing very well. In this video, as I promised you beforehand in my shorts, that I shall be talking about the decolonial poetics of Indian writing in English. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on the decolonial aspects of understanding in the English poetry written by the Indian writers. So this is the thrust area of the talk. See, in Indian writing in English, especially in the poetry, whenever we are talking about poetry, the development of poetry by the Indian writers in English, there is a surprising fact. Poetry existed almost 5,000 years before the formal development of English poetry written by the Indian writers. Because if you look at the Indic civilization, the poetry as a form, as an oral form, existed much earlier in our epic tradition. For example, in Ramayana and Mahabharata, and also in the Vedic hymns, you will find beautiful references, beautiful examples of poetry. So in India, in our civilization, poetry as a form, as a literary form, might not exist, but it was always there. In comparison to poetry, prose was a later development. However, whenever we are talking about the development of Indian poetry in English written by the Indian writers, there is a surprising fact that poetry has never ever gained that much attention, that much celebratory nature in comparison to Indian writers and their prose works. There is different reasons for that. We shall be unraveling some of the reasons in the video, but in this line of thought, let me make a brief point of understanding that in this video I shall be trying to trace the development of the decolonial poetics that the Indian writers in English tried to develop through their act of writing poetry in English. And for this, I am trying to focus on 3 or 4 major poetic figures. The first one is Manmohan Ghosh, second one is your Henry Louis Vivian Derozio, third one is Miss Toru Dutt, and fourth or fifth might be your R.N. Tagore, your Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate, and Aurobindo Ghosh. So I am going to focus my talk based on these 5 characters. See, Indian writing in English developed as a result of official dictum in 1835. In 1835, it was Thomas Babington Macaulay who tried to pass the minute that all the Indians should be trained in thinking and writing in English so that they can be a perfect intermediate or the in-between actor between the British master and the native Indians. As a result, the Macaulay's Minute, which is famously known as Macaulay's Minute in 1835, it was sanctioned by the then Governor General Lord Bentinck. And as a result of Macaulay's Minute, and after 1835 in Indian education policy and education system, we had seen the tremendous development and interest in learning English. Therefore, all the Indian languages, Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, every one of them took the back seat, and English learning, English education almost captured the imagination, the rational thought pattern of the Indians. And ultimately, as a result of Macaulay's Minutes, we have been able to see the rise of the Babu class or the Sahib class, who are basically the mimic men according to the terminology of Homi Bhabha. Why they're mimic men? Because they're imitating the British education, British culture, British etiquette, but they're Indian by blood. Their complexion is brown or dark, I would say, but now they're actually the flag bearers of the British sovereignty in the Indian land. So as a result, what happened is that Macaulay's Minute created this kind of tremendous divide. So the Indians who learnt English, they always occupied the lucrative government services, and the Indians who failed to do so, they were unable to secure a good job or good prospect for their future. And as a result, when the poetry as a literary form was developing very slowly in the hands of Indian writers, we have seen the imitative form. First of all, in this line of thought, we must mention the poet Manmohan Ghosh. Manmohan Ghosh was an important poet, but if I am going to refer to his contribution in Indian poetry in general in English, you would see he is famous for the poem known as Saraswati. Saraswati, the poem written by Manmohan Ghosh, if you read the text, I'm not going to refer to the poem in general here. Saraswati is theme-wise or thematically, it is devoted to the Indian goddess of planning, Devi Saraswati. But the form, the language, everything is very much influenced by the British poets of that time. And henceforth, Manmohan Ghosh is heavily criticized later times by the critics that he has imitated the English poetry form in general. However, Manmohan Ghosh is trying to take a baby step towards the very movement of forwarding the Indian poetry in general, where he would be able to fold some kind of literary example for the future Indian writers who are trying to follow his footsteps. So his poetry was very much imitative by nature, but at the same time, we must not forgetful of the fact that there was some kind of decolonial venture nascent within it. Why? Because he tried to emulate the English thought pattern, English vocabulary, English imagination, but he tried to fit in all those British subject matters, thematics, and the rhyme scheme, everything into a proper Indian theme. So it was one kind of hybridity, one of the perfect examples of hybridity, where it tried to bridge the gap between the Indian thought pattern and the British expression or the British articulative form. Later, we find the reference to Henry Vivian Derozio. He was not an Indian by blood. He was coming from a Portuguese family. His father was a Portuguese and his mother was a British. And he was born in the year 1809 in Kolkata, and he died in the year 1833. So it was very 21 years, very brief lifespan, but Derozio was a prolific writer, educator, social reformist, and he was the pathfinder in Indian poetry in English, where he tried to afford what an Indian poetry in English should be. Derozio was not at all an Indian, because in the modern term you can call him that he was an Eurasian poet. He has very little Indian blood, but he loved to call himself an Indian poet because he dealt with his themes based on India, and India was a subject matter for his poetry. If you read three of his monumental poems, like "Into India, My Native Land," second one is "To the Peoples of Hindu College," and the third one is "The Fakir of Jangira." So these three major writings by Derozio focused on his patriotic zeal for the land called India, and his subject matter was very much Indian. He tried to revive Indian folklore, Indian romantic ideas, and also he tried to mix with this kind of Indian themes the very British accent, very British vocabulary, and the very much rhyme pattern followed by P.B. Shelley. And in this matter of fact, I must mention that Derozio was heavily influenced by the British romantic poet Percy B.C. Shelley. So the impact of Shelley was tremendous on Derozio, but however, in spite of having the impact of Shelley on him, he tried to create a genuine Indian poetry whose soul should be an Indian. Unlike Manmohan Ghosh, he developed the Indian poetry in the thought pattern where the patriotic zeal is very much nascent. At the same time, he tried to revive those exotic folklores, exotic romantic tales of India from various other parts of Indian state, so that India as a continent must be poetically represented through his oeuvre. Next, we are having the poetic figure of Miss Toru Dutt. She, like Henry Vivian Derozio, had a very brief lifespan. She died at the age of 21, though she was born and brought up in an educated upper middle class Bengali family. She lived 4 years in France and Britain, and his 4 years of long stay in the Europe shaped his poetic genius, poetic talent, and he was very much shaped by the poetic theories and poetic outputs of William Wordsworth. And in the major writings such as the Lotus, Lakshmana, Our Casual in a Tree, these three are the major romantic poems written by Miss Toru Dutt. Here you will find the theme is very much all about nostalgia, lost homeland, memoryscape, date, lost love, and at the same time, he's trying to evoke an idyllic picture of Indian life, and the theme is very much Indian. However, the some words are there which she used. Some words are very much Indian in nature. However, the impact of William Wordsworth was very much there, and she continued the tradition of imitative poetry as such. Later times, the decolonial venture in Indian poetry was properly observed in the writings of Aurobindo Ghosh. So Aurobindo Ghosh was basically a Bengali by birth, but he was basically European. His behavior, his demeanor, his thought pattern, everything was heavily shaped by his European upbringing. And he was the first Indian poet who developed a theory of poetry. If you read the treatise, The Future Poetry by Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, you will be able to find this poetic theory. And he is the first poet among all the Indian writers who formulated a solid theory of poetry. Aurobindo Ghosh in general tried to develop an independent, strong voice of an Indian poet. And later times, though Rabindranath won the Nobel Prize, he is the trendsetter for his Gitanjali poems. However, he was not at all continuing the legacy left behind Sri Aurobindo. So somehow Rabindranath developed his own poetic theory that was very much decolonial because he wanted to infuse within it the aspects of Indic spirituality, the unique hallmark of Indic civilization, and the perfect poetic articulation of it through his Gitanjali poems. So now, if after brief discussion of the work and the influences of these five Indian poets in English, if I try to trace the decolonial elements, I must say Indian poetry in English has always been treated as a subaltern poetry by the pure European minds. Why? Because it is the voice of the third world poets who are trying to carve a space for their own selves, and that is why their poetry has never ever been treated very seriously. But before Rabindranath, nobody has taken Indian poetry very much seriously. Somehow, whenever we are trying to trace the gradual development of the decolonial voice, the voice of the Indian poet who wants to claim their own space in the poetry genre in the global platform, there is always the tradition that both Manmohan Ghosh and Derozio, they followed the imitative pattern. At the same time, Derozio developed the imitative trend by writing in English, by infusing English diction, English form, the proper Indian soul, the proper Indian subject matter, the Indian vocabulary, and that is why he advanced the cause of Indian poetry in English. Later times, when we find in the poetry of Miss Toru Dutt, it is the poetry of a female poet who is very much searching for a home. What kind of home was that? Was it a home for herself, or was it a home for the Indian poetry in general? That is a debatable question. And later times in the poetry of Aurobindo Ghosh, we find that distinctive Indian voice. He tried to dovetail the unique Indic notion of Indic spiritual awareness into the poetic theme of his own brilliance. And later times we find in the poetry of R.N. Tagore the distinctive Indian voice where he beautifully sings the paean for his motherland India, where poetry is not only the art of living, but poetry is a philosophy. The deep connection, the intersection between poetry and philosophy, between materiality and spirituality, he blended seamlessly in his poetry. That is why he has been able to raise the concern that Indian poetry is trying to decolonize itself from the deadly clutches of the European minds who always try to categorize it as a subaltern poetic aesthetics. If you like this video, do like and share this video, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more similar updates like this. Thank you for watching. Stay blessed. Bye bye.